Hey guys! Part 4 of What If Naruto Graduates 2 Years Early. Hit like and subscribe if you like this one, and also please check the author in the description. Let's start. Chapter 8, Wave, Tree Climbing and Elemental Affinity. Naruto stared down at the piece of paper that Kakashi had given him dubiously. Kakashi had decided to test his elemental affinity out of the blue that morning. While a ninja could learn elemental jutsu that were outside of their affinity, even without knowing one's affinity, elemental jutsu that were of one's affinity were usually much easier to learn and that much more potent. Truly mastering one's affinity, especially to the point where one could manipulate chakra to transform it into that elemental nature, and possibly even create new jutsu, took years. Usually, a ninja started mastering their affinity when they made Chunin. Tetsuo Sensei had promised to test him the minute he got his vest, and help him master his affinity as soon as he knew what it was. Naruto's problem wasn't with any of that, as he'd been dying with curiosity to learn what his affinity was, and didn't think Tetsuo Sensei would mind too much if he took an early peek. The problem he had at the moment was with the chakra test paper itself. "And tell me again what happens if my affinity is fire?" he asked, hoping that he misheard Kakashi when the man had been explaining the different reactions that the special paper had to different chakra types. "The paper will burn," Kakashi replied. Yeah, that's what he thought he heard. The paper would burn, and it would be in his hand when that happened too. Considering the fact that the predominant affinity in Konoha was fire, and the fact that he didn't know who his father was aside from the fact that he'd been a resident of Konoha. "Don't worry, it's perfectly safe," Kakashi said, trying to reassure him. It wasn't all that reassuring, though. "How many of these things do you have on you?" he asked. "A few. Why?" Kakashi replied. "Here's Sasuke," he said as he handed his paper to the boy who had been looking at it with a jealous gleam in his eye. He'd seen the boy using fire jutsu with relative ease, and, while that could be the result of early training by a fire-aligned family, it was more likely the result of an untested fire affinity. The instant he made his offer, the boy snatched the test paper from him almost greedily, and started to channel chakra into it as Kakashi had instructed him to do. Crinkle. Fwoosh. Ow. Saniva. Stomp. 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 That pretty much had been what he had thought would happen. The double affinity was interesting, though. Maybe it was an extra Kekkai Genkai, considering the fact that there were Kekkai Genkai that allowed people to mix two different elements to create a new advanced element. Double Kekkai Genkai had shown up in some families on occasion, though. Usually when you tried to mix two Kekkai Genkai, all you got was a mess. At least, that's what he'd heard happened. He wondered what fire and lightning would make, other than a more effective way of destroying things, that is. As soon as the first paper was finally disposed of by the Uchiha, Kakashi offered him a second piece of the test paper to replace the one he'd given to Sasuke. He didn't want to take it, though. Watching someone else get burned by one of the things had been enough to make him definitely not want to risk it, rather than be somewhat cautious about doing so. "Look, Naruto, it's perfectly safe," Kakashi said, sounding slightly frustrated. "Your mother's affinity was water, and therefore there is virtually no chance of you being a fire affinity, since water is a dominant trait that drowns out fire roughly 999 times out of 1,000 in such pairings. And there is a very good chance that your father wasn't a fire affinity anyways. Why the hell hadn't he said so in the first place? If he just explained that earlier, Sasuke wouldn't have had to go through the trauma of having his fingers burned just now, and he wouldn't have had to go through the trauma of watching it happen. Well, at least Sasuke had gotten something out of the experience. Sighing, he took the paper and channeled chakra into it. It cut itself in two. Wind. Figured, since the few wind jutsu he'd learned had come to him much more easily than the fire jutsu he dubbed the arsonist's best friend that he'd picked up. And that one was a rather small flame that wasn't nearly as noticeable as the flashier and higher-ranking fire jutsu that some ninja had a habit of flinging about. Well, now that that's out of the way, I may as well start Sasuke and Sakura on their training before I show you the first exercise of your elemental training," Kakashi said. Sasuke and Sakura perked up at this slightly, as Kakashi turned his focus on them. Today you will be learning to climb trees, Kakashi said cheerfully. The instant Kakashi made that announcement, he found himself pitying Sasuke. That had been incredibly mean of the man. Most ninja tended to gather their chakra by using either the ram's seal or a one-handed variant of it. Sasuke's left arm was broken and in an improvised cast, making the ram's seal and just about every other seal for that matter impossible, and he had several burned fingers on the arm that wasn't broken, which would make forming the half-ram painfully difficult. Not only that, but he was suffering from the aftereffects of a concussion as well. Kakashi was clearly enjoying the dumbfounded looks his two students were giving him over the fact that they were finally going to learn the tree climbing exercise. Well, as far as he was concerned, it was about damn time. They said that each sensei had their own teaching style, but waiting 5 months before teaching one of the most basic chakra control exercises bordered on criminal. He himself had started learning it during his first few days under Tetsuo-sensei. "You'll be doing it without your hands," Kakashi said cheerfully in reply to Sakura's whine of "but I already know how to climb trees." Kakashi was definitely enjoying this like the sadistic bastard he was reputed to be. Poor Sasuke. "Naruto here will demonstrate," Kakashi said, putting him on the spot. "Great." Heaving a put-upon sigh, he walked up to the nearest tree and started walking up the trunk, which was bare of branches for about the first 30 feet or so in a spiral pattern. He then selected a branch that was in full view of the others and walked along its underside, stopping about midway. Both Sasuke and Sakura gaped up at him. Sasuke looked jealous of his rather pedestrian ability. Then again, Sasuke always looked either upset or jealous when he did something the other boy hadn't learned yet. "To do this, you must concentrate your chakra onto the soles of your feet," Kakashi explained to his students. "Too much, and you crack the bark of the tree and fly off. Too little, and you won't stick. Use these to mark your progress," Kakashi said as he threw a pair of kunai into the ground in front of Sakura and Sasuke. Sasuke naturally had a great deal of difficulty with the exercise, which was completely understandable considering the condition he was in. Sakura managed it perfectly the first time. Apparently the girl had near perfect to perfect chakra control. The medical corps would be drooling over her if they found out. The medical corps had suffered a severe drop in enlistment over the last few years because genjutsu had become a fashionable specialty amongst kunoichi, who were much more likely to have the perfect chakra control necessary for medical jutsu than their male counterparts. He knew this because medical corps had been after Suzume ever since she'd made Chunin. "You'd better hide Sakura when we get back to Konoha, Kakashi, or the medical corps will try to steal her," he said half-jokingly after Sakura had made her way up the tree. Considering how desperate they were for qualified new recruits, he wouldn't be surprised if that actually happened. Sakura stared at Naruto from the high branch she was perched in. With an offhand remark, the boy had handed her an out she could take without disgracing herself or her family should she choose to do so. If she trained as a medic, she could work in the hospital, as in off the field and away from battle. Medics were highly prized, and retired medics could go into practice as medical doctors after a certain number of years of service as a medic should they choose to do so. If she became a medic, she would have the career she needed and the training she needed when she left the ninja life forever. Becoming a medic had another potential positive as well. If she decided that she didn't want to completely waste several years of effort she had put into becoming a kunoichi so far, and wanted to achieve the goal that had gotten her to attend the academy in the first place. Instead of deciding to leave once her 5 years or however long it took to get her certification as a doctor were up, however, medics would be valued amongst the ANBU as well. Someone would have to make sure the prisoner survived until it was brought in, or patch the team up if things went south. It may as well be her if it was anybody. Either way, training as a medic would be useful for her future whichever path she decided to take. That, and it would be useful when she was married to Sasuke, as she had learned that children sometimes got themselves into the serious sort of trouble where seconds could mean the difference between life and death. Statistics for this were especially high in ninja villages where one had the risk of accidentally stabbing oneself with a poison weapon or setting off an explosive tag accidentally added on top of the usual risks. Should she choose to become a medic on the path towards leaving the ninja life rather than on the path towards staying, however, there was a slight hitch to this plan. Either her sensei would have to sign her up for the program if he felt her capable, or she would have to become a chunin in order to sign herself up if her sensei refused for whatever reason. Since there currently wasn't a surplus of genin, and the spring cycle class was evenly divisible by 3 as well, there was a good chance that Kakashi-sensei wouldn't split the team up before they took the chunin exams, as Naruto had informed her that they needed a whole team to compete. Either way, the odds that she would have to take the chunin exams were high, and if she did, she would have to do her damned hardest to pass, in case Kakashi-sensei refused to sign the forms releasing her from his team. Either path she chose, her life would not start until after the team entered the chunin exams. Until then, she would have to learn all she could of the shinobi arts in order to pass the exams when the time came. Hopefully, she would be strong enough that she wouldn't be squashed as an afterthought by then. Sasuke growled as he tried once more to make his way up the tree. Once again, he didn't make it past a few feet, and most of the distance he'd attained had been more from the momentum he'd built up on the way to the tree. Sakura, who had never done this before, had been able to manage to make her way to the top of her tree perfectly the first time. Kakashi said it was because she had so little chakra that she was able to control it easily, but he wasn't too sure. He would do this, however. He would master this to the point that he was better than that boy who had climbed his tree with the greatest of ease and hung upside down until Kakashi called him over for some special advanced training. As he struggled to climb the tree, he tried to figure out whether that boy had been playing with him or with Kakashi when he'd handed him that test paper. While it had made for a rather vicious prank as he'd gotten his fingers burned, he now knew his elemental affinity, or affinities rather. It was quite possible that he would not have learned them until much later if that boy who had already been certain of at least one of his affinities hadn't handed him that paper. What was that boy up to? Had that boy been trying to do him a favor, or was this the start of some twisted new game? Relax, Sasuke. That boy called over to him from near where he stood with Kakashi. It's a whole lot easier when you're not frustrated. You should stop a while, use one of the meditation techniques they taught at the academy, and try again. Stop and meditate? What the hell was that boy playing at? You should use Kage Bunshin on this exercise to get the most out of it, Kakashi said after he'd finished explaining the leaf-cutting exercise and its purpose to his student. But Tetsuo-sensei told me not to, Naruto replied. This reply naturally added to his frustration. Ever since Naruto had become his student, it had been Tetsuo-sensei this, and Tetsuo-sensei that. But Tetsuo-sensei said seemed to be the boy's favorite phrase. Not once had he heard a Kakashi-sensei from the boy. He'd heard 100 yes sirs, but no yes Kakashi-sensei. He understood that Naruto was upset at being taken from his former sensei, but he would still like at least a little acknowledgement for his role in the boy's life. Why did Shimura tell you not to? He asked, wondering why the man would handicap Naruto's potential progress in such a manner. Using Kage Bunshin would allow the boy to learn things much faster, especially with the sheer number of shadow clones that the boy could create. What would normally take the boy years to learn could be whittled down to mere weeks or even days depending on the number of Kage Bunshin that were used. Naruto looked embarrassed, and slightly guilty for some reason, as if his not being allowed to use Kage Bunshin for training had been his own failing and not his previous teachers. I made them study while I ran off to play once, and Tetsuo-sensei caught me, Naruto replied. As long as you are working alongside the Kage Bunshin, it should be fine, he said, resolving to have words with Shimura for hampering his student's progress due to a youthful error. Naruto gave him a look, but reluctantly complied. Reluctant compliance had been all he'd gotten out of the boy since day one. It was rather disheartening. He wouldn't quit trying, however, he'd get through to the boy eventually. He made a vow to teach Minato-sensei's son, as Minato-sensei had taught him, and by all of the gods in existence, he would do it, despite the fact that someone had seemed to have gotten there first. Chapter 9, Wave, Meeting and Almost Meeting. While Zabuza was not yet well enough to be up and about, he was well enough that he could be left alone for a few hours without worry, and Haku needed to restock his supply of medicinal herbs. It had been a few days since the fight with the copy ninja and his genin, and the paralysis and chakra exhaustion had nearly worn off. Zabuza would need some more bed rest though before he was fully recovered, but, in his current condition, he would easily be able to defend himself from any of Gato's 2-bit thugs, should they decide to bother him. After checking on his master, Haku dressed himself in his favorite outfit and prepared to head out. He knew about the comments that were made about the fact that he often dressed like a girl even when he did not need to disguise himself as such, and didn't particularly care. He knew he was a boy no matter how he looked or what he wore, and if he wanted to dress like a girl, that was his prerogative. Besides, this outfit was made from a more comfortable material than the ones he usually wore when there was the possibility of going into battle, and while pink wasn't his favorite color, he wasn't averse to wearing it. When he made his way to a clearing that he noted contained the plants he would need when he'd passed through it earlier, he found a boy lying on the ground asleep, looking as if he had collapsed from exhaustion where he stood, too tired to seek shelter. His first instinct when he'd come across the boy who had been dressed in a dark orange shirt that was decorated with the red spiral he'd seen on the Konoha shinobi uniforms on one of the sleeves, and one of the spiral and a target symbols that he'd seen scattered throughout Yuzushigakure's ruins on the other had been to do whatever it took to protect Zabuza-sama. In this case, protecting Zabuza-sama would be to not allow the boy to get away and alert his companions to Zabuza-sama's likely survival if they weren't aware of the possibility already. Instead of killing the boy like he should have done, however, he yet again proved that he was too soft to truly be a shinobi, and shook him awake. "You shouldn't be sleeping out here, especially in your weakened condition. You could catch your death of cold. It's still March, you know, and a cold snap could come on suddenly," he said to the boy who had startled awake and scurried backward when he had realized who was shaking him. "I don't care," the boy said. "I have to train. I have to become stronger than him." "I believe that you become truly strong when you have someone precious to protect," he said to the boy. He knew this to be the truth because he was at his strongest when he was protecting Zabuza-sama. While training was well and good, and training oneself into the ground on occasion built character, there was a point where it was too much, and it looked like the boy had taken it that far. He'd done so himself enough times to know that training to the point of collapse too often was counterproductive and left him weak at times when he needed to be strong enough to protect Zabuza-sama. The boy gave him a strange look that seemed to be disbelief coupled with something he couldn't quite identify in response to his statement. "Do you have someone precious to you? Someone you'd do anything to protect?" he asked the boy. "Not anymore," the boy said. "They're all gone. That man killed them." That threw him slightly. He'd been living with the impression that people in Konoha had lived easy lives where the worst one of their extremely coddled children had to face was an orphanage where they'd be fed for a long while. The boy in front of him, though, was like he had been before Zabuza-sama had found him and given him purpose, unhappy and completely alone. "I lost my precious people once," he said quietly, remembering the day when his father had killed his mother, and he had killed his father, and a number of the people in the small village he used to live in self-defense. "Someone found me, and gave me a reason to live. Someday, you'll find someone else, and you'll be happy again when you do." The boy gave him a dubious look, as if he didn't believe him and didn't want to believe him. It was true, however. While he was still sad over the loss of his family and would always mourn the loss of his parents, he was happy he had Zabuza-sama. Zabuza needed him, and for as long as Zabuza-sama needed him, he would remain by his side serving him in every way he needed him to throughout good times and bad. "Let me look at that arm of yours," he said, holding out his hand for the boy's broken arm, which had been put in a temporary cast, deciding to change the subject to something a bit less deeply personal. While there was little to nothing he could do about the fact that all of the Konoha boy's precious people were gone, there was possibly something he could do about the boy's arm. Aside from knowing a great deal of herb lore, he had a few medical ninjutsu in his repertoire, and one of them was one that sped up the healing of broken bones considerably. The boy who was giving him a highly suspicious glare didn't look like he would cooperate with his request, though. "I'm a fully trained medic," he said. That last statement had been slightly fudged, but he knew how to deal with broken bones, and had been forced to do so a couple days ago when he was tending to Zabuza after his battle with the copy ninja. He knew that he was taking a serious risk in doing this, but he couldn't just leave an injured person without trying to help, even if they were on the opposite side of a conflict he was involved in. The boy reluctantly complied, continuing to look at him suspiciously as if he expected him to stab him at any second. The boy clearly knew that he was in no shape to win any fight that would break out between them, however, and had therefore refrained from attacking. He took the offered arm and gently examined it. It had been a clean break, and the bone had been properly set. Under such favorable conditions, there was very easily something he could do for the boy, and after using one of the few medical jutsu he knew, the bone was healed. "You should get back," he said when he was finished. "Your sensei is undoubtedly worried about you." With a grunted thanks, the dark-haired boy left. He had no illusions that the boy wouldn't report him to his teacher. He would have to swiftly vacate the area and pick a different spot in which to gather the herbs he needed as quickly as he could so he could get back to Zabuza-sama as soon as possible. Aside from this and a nearby clearing, there was another clearing near the Yuzushiogaku ruins that held the plants he was after as well. The clearing near the ruins seemed to be the safer choice, especially should the boy's teacher go looking for him rather than wait for him and Zabuza to come to them as they would be later on. After vacating the clearing which the Konoha genin had just departed, he made his way to the ruins to gather the herbs he needed. After he was done, he paused at the ruins as he customarily did while on his way back to Zabuza-sama, despite the fact that tarrying in such a manner was inadvisable. It was there that he saw the blonde boy he met in Kiri and had seen again on the road escorting Zabuza-sama's target. He immediately recognized him because the boy was rather unforgettable with that wild blonde hair, and those whisker marks that looked to have been tattooed onto his cheeks. The boy was carrying a bouquet of wild flowers as he wandered through the ruins for some strange reason. As the boy moved through the ruins, he seemed to be searching for something rather than wandering aimlessly. He hoped that whatever the boy was searching for, it wasn't him, because he wasn't in the mood to fight, and didn't want to be forced to kill the other ninja whom he was certain would recognize him for what he was, if he didn't recognize him for who he was. Some ninja had long memories, and some didn't. Eventually, the boy made his way into the overgrown graveyard that was choked with weeds, and after searching around for a while, he stopped in the section that contained a number of graves belonging to a clan called Uzumaki. "My name is Uzumaki Naruto," the boy who had offered to treat him to dinner said loudly with a bright smile on his face as he fiddled with a pair of chopsticks, impatiently waiting for the old man to finish preparing his ramen. "I'm going to be the Hokage someday." As he watched from the shadows, the blonde boy summoned a number of Kage Bunshin and, after setting the bouquet down on a random headstone, he joined them in cleaning up the cemetery. He was almost tempted to join the boy in his task, but he refrained from doing so. If the Uzumaki child who he couldn't forget was a Konoha ninja didn't recognize him as the girl he'd met in Kiri, he would surely recognize the fact that he was a ninja, and they would be forced to fight. He didn't want to fight the blonde boy since the boy was in obvious good health, was an unknown quantity skill-wise considering how many Kage Bunshin he was capable of producing with minimal effort, and would be fully willing to attack him in order to protect his client, as the outcome of the battle could potentially be in his favor. He had gotten lucky with the dark-haired boy who had been suffering from a mild case of chakra exhaustion on top of his other injuries earlier, and he knew it. He didn't believe that his luck would hold twice in one day. "I don't know which of you guys are my grandparents, but I'll bring flowers for all of you later," the Uzumaki boy said as he picked the bouquet of flowers back up when he and his clones had finished clearing all of the weeds out of the cemetery. The boy then carried the flowers to the Killed in Action monument that was located near the center of the cemetery, and laid them down before saying a brief prayer for the dead. Every shinobi village had such a monument, though they were never quite the same as, or in the same location as the memorials any other given village. Yuzushiogaku's was a slab of black granite which had been polished at one time, which had the symbol of the village and the names of the dead etched into it. Time had taken the shine off of it, and begun to wear the names away, but they were still legible, and a large number of them had been Uzumaki. As he watched the boy pay his respects to his fallen relatives, he felt slightly guilty, as if he were spying on something private. It was then that he realized that he had been trespassing in the home of this boy's ancestors for years without once properly paying his respects to the dead. While the Uzumaki's attention was turned elsewhere, he quietly left the cemetery, hoping the boy wouldn't notice that someone had intruded on his solitude. Naruto got up from where he had been kneeling in front of the Yuzushio monument. He had had the feeling that he was being watched the entire time he'd been in the ruins of the former ninja village, but now it was gone. Whether that was because his ancestors had been appeased by his attempts to pay his respects or because someone had actually been watching him and only just left, he didn't know. He had asked Tazuna-san for directions to the village earlier this morning, and the old man had rather reluctantly given them to him. It seemed that people avoided this place, believing it to be haunted. He too had a fear of ghosts, and had been slightly nervous when he had felt someone watching him from the shadows and had been unable to see him, or her. If it had been a spirit, they apparently weren't offended by his presence. To get here today, he had taken one of the sorts of breaks from training that would have had Tetsuo-sensei rip him a new one if he'd caught him doing it. He had left his Kage Bunshin to do all of the work while he went and did something else. Tetsuo-sensei had told him that leaving his Kage Bunshin behind to do all the work was an exceedingly stupid and lazy thing to do when he had caught him doing it, as he would get in the habit of foisting all of his tasks off on his clones and never really learn to do anything for himself because his clones would then become lazier as a result of him becoming lazier, starting a vicious cycle. But today, there had been some extenuating circumstances. He had wanted to pay his respects to the ancestors he had never known in case he didn't get a chance to do so later, and hadn't wanted to stop his training either. After setting his clones to the leaf-cutting task that they seemed to be close to accomplishing, he had set out to gather flowers as an offering as there had not been any to be bought in the small town near Tazuna's house. Once he had the flowers, he came here. The ruins of Yuzushiogaku were a desolate and lonely place, and some of the buildings looked as if they had been scavenged for building materials. Considering the current economic situation and the price of such materials, he understood why the locals had done so, and didn't begrudge them what they took since it would be better for them to be of use to the living than to crumble to dust and be completely forgotten. At least, the people who had gone scavenging for building materials had had the decency to leave the graveyard and the monument alone. The only issue he had with that was that it had been left entirely alone, and it looked as if nobody had come to tend to any of the graves in years if not decades. Deciding that it was the least he could do, he summoned another batch of Kage Bunshin and weeded the place while the one he'd assigned as a scout went to look for the village's Kia memorial. He knew that every village had one, because he'd asked Tetsuo-sensei about it when he'd spotted Kiris before the start of the rather ill-fated Chunin exams. Eventually, the cemetery was cleared, the monument was found, he'd been able to pay his respects, and the strange presence that had been making him nervous had vanished. He didn't get very much time to ponder the reason behind the vanishing of the other presents. Considering the fact that one of the Kage Bunshin that had just dispelled had been informed by Kakashi that there had been some sort of incident with Sasuke earlier, he decided that it would be better to shelve that mystery for later and should head back to Tazuna's. Sasuke looked down at his arm once more. Someone who was his enemy, and therefore pretty much had an obligation to kill him, had healed him instead. Why? Why do something like that for a complete stranger that you would be fighting if not then later? Had he healed him so he would have a better fight when the time came, or had he really done it out of the kindness of his heart, as he had appeared to have done? What the boy who had dressed like a girl had said about finding someone who would give him purpose and becoming happy again had bothered him as well. How would he ever be happy again with his entire family gone? Who would he find that would compare to the people he had lost? And if he did find someone who compared, what would happen to that person if that man were still alive and found out about them? That man had told him that in order to get the eyes he needed to be able to come close to equaling him, he would have to kill the one closest to him. That would naturally be any precious person he found or who found him. Would he really kill his precious person after he found him or her in order to avenge his clan? Most disturbing to him was the fact that a part of himself had said yes. It would seem that to protect this precious person, whoever he or she may be, the best thing to do would be to never find them in order to protect them from himself. Chapter 10 Wave, the Battle on the Bridge. Naruto swore. The two bastards from about a week ago had shown up at least a day earlier than expected and in a place that had been completely unexpected considering the usual modus operandi of the sort of missing nin who were of a more mercenary bent. Rather than showing up in a place where they could cause a great deal of collateral damage which would have left the team scrabbling to protect innocent bystanders, They had turned up on a newly built section of bridge he hadn't gotten around to trapping yet because he'd run out of certain necessary materials and hadn't found ones he could use to jury-rig traps that would capture a ninja. He was now seriously regretting focusing more on Tezuna's home and the nearby village, where he believed an attack more likely due to the fact that the team would be distracted trying to avoid harm befalling innocent bystanders and therefore be more vulnerable. He swore again when he realized that he'd flipping left Tezuna's home almost completely unprotected aside from a few traps he'd shown Tezuna's family to avoid in case he wasn't around to set off the others for some reason, as he deemed automatic traps that didn't require someone there to set them off to be a danger in this case, especially with small children and untrained civilians around. Looking back now, he realized that he should have thought to leave at least one clone behind to activate the traps he had set. As Tetsuo Sensei used to say, bad things happen when people don't think. After he finished swearing, he made a few Kage Bunshin while Sasuke was busy cutting down Zabuza's Mizu Bunshin at Kakashi's urging and dispatched them to Tezuna's residence in case there was someone else waiting in the wings to try something underhanded while he and his team were otherwise occupied. Zabuza had one accomplice with him, and logic dictated that where there was one, there was usually more, and that any of the ones he couldn't see in front of him could be getting up to any amount of mischief. When he turned back to the fight after sending the clones off, the Zabuza guy himself had shown up along with his masked accomplice. The instant after they appeared, Sasuke volunteered to be the one to deal with the accomplice, which meant that he would be hanging back with the rest of the team and protecting the client until it looked like Sasuke needed assistance. Despite the prodigious speed of Zabuza's accomplice, who was so fast that he created his own whirlwind, Sasuke had him evenly matched. This wasn't all that surprising considering that two areas that Sasuke seemed to really shine in were speed and taijutsu, so he was the better choice to face Zabuza's accomplice in a straight-up fight in this case. From the looks of things, Sasuke wouldn't be needing any help despite his opponent's surprising ability to make one-handed seals, which was revealed when Sasuke had restrained the other hand. Based on Sasuke's current speed and the speed of those water, or rather ice summon, Sasuke would be able to easily escape the jutsu. His job for now was to protect the client from Zabuza, who had not yet made a single move in their direction since the destruction of his Mizu Bunshin for some strange reason. Inari had been on the toilet when he had heard the loud swearing coming from outside. His first thought when he'd heard it had been that one of the neighbors had stopped by for a visit and had run afoul of one of Naruto's traps. He'd nearly done that himself on more than one occasion, and had almost had to be rescued once. That initial notion had been thrown out the window when he heard his mother scream and several dishes shatter, however. When he ran out of the toilet to see what was happening, he saw two men with swords taking his mother hostage. One of the men had tattoos on his face that reminded him of clown makeup and was wearing a hoodie, and the other one, who wore an eye patch with 3 straps, was topless and covered in tattoos. When they noticed him, the one with the tattoos on his chest and arms moved to attack him. "If you hurt him, I'll kill myself," his mother said, halting the man in his tracks. "You need a hostage, right? And you won't have one if you harm him." The man, who was some sort of rogue swordsman, turned away from him and back to his mother, who glared at him defiantly, daring him to make a move. The rogue swordsman and his partner then bound his mother and started dragging her away as he stood by and watched helplessly. They had taken his mother, and there had been nothing he could do about it. If Naruto were here, he would. Whatever he would do, it wouldn't be standing here watching as his mother was dragged away like he was doing. That Kakashi man had told him as much a couple days earlier. The boy named Naruto who'd lectured him on his first day here came in 5 minutes after the boy named Sasuke, completely wiped from his training. When he slumped over at the dinner table after the meal had ended, it was obvious that he was completely exhausted, even more so than the Sasuke boy, who looked pretty tore up himself. "Why?" he asked. "Why do you do this when it's not even your fight? It's not your country, and it's not your business. Why do you do this even knowing that you're just going to die?" "Because this was once my mother's home. And even if it wasn't her home, I'd do it anyway because it's the right thing to do," Naruto replied, sounding upset. "I could just as easily ask you why you sit around wailing that you can do nothing while your people suffer without even trying to do something about it." Unable to reply to the boy's accusation since he couldn't think of one that didn't sound like a pathetic excuse even to himself, he ran outside. Even though every reply he could think of sounded like an excuse, he knew that there was nothing that he could do about the way things were. He was just too small, and there was only one of him. As he was sitting on the dock that was attached to the house thinking how unfair the Naruto boy's question had been, Naruto's teacher came outside and joined him. "Naruto's like you in some ways," Kakashi-san said. "He never knew his father while growing up as well." As he furiously scrubbed the tears from his eyes so he wouldn't look like a total sissy in front of this stranger, he wondered why the man was telling him this. He never knew his mother either, since both of his parents died the day he was born. He had no friends as a small child, but he never let that get him down, and I've never once seen him cry about the fact that he was alone, even when there had been no one there for him. "I think he got tired of crying early on," Kakashi-san continued. He sat still wondering exactly where this story was going since so far, all he was hearing was that Naruto didn't cry despite the fact that he didn't have any parents. Naruto's life wasn't anything like his, however. No evil man had taken over his home and killed the man he called father right in front of him. What few friends he did manage to make became all the more precious to him because they had been few and far between. Kakashi-san continued. What did this have to do with him? So, Naruto had had a bad life, but not as bad as his. One day, 2 of his friends were killed, and 3 others were badly injured right in front of him, and he was then left to face 2 much larger and stronger opponents alone since there was nobody around to help. Kakashi-san said. What happened next? He asked, realizing what the man had finally been getting at. Instead of fleeing, Naruto did what he had to do to save his friends, even though there was a very good chance that he could die doing so. At that point, all he cared about was getting his remaining friends to safety, and he did everything it took to do so despite the fact that he was outarmed, outnumbered, and the enemy held the advantage. Kakashi-san replied. Here he was in a similar situation to the one Naruto had been in back then. His mother was being taken away from him, and rather than fighting, he was sitting and crying about not being able to do anything without even once trying. His stepfather Kaiza had told him that if there was something precious to you, you protected it with your own 2 hands, even if it meant risking dying. Right now, the most precious thing in his life was being taken from him, and he wasn't even trying to protect it. Like hell. There was a time when someone had to stop crying and running away, and stand up to fight for what was theirs no matter how strong the people taking it from them were, and that time was now. Let go of my mom! He yelled at the 2 men who were leading his mother away after he'd run from the house and onto the wooden walkway that led to the path to the village to confront them. Run, Inari! His mother yelled as the 2 men whirled to face him. As she yelled for him to flee, one of the men knocked her to the ground. They had hurt his mother. He was going to kill them. He had no weapons, and the men who had his mother had swords, but that didn't matter. Like in that old story, he would hit them, and if they cut off his arms, he would kick them, and if they cut off his legs, he would bite them to death. He wasn't going to let them take his mother away from him. His mother was one of the most precious things in his life, and he would do everything in his power to protect her. The men moved to attack him, and he suddenly found himself elsewhere. Thanks for distracting them, kid, said Naruto, who had shown up out of nowhere, taken him out of the path of danger, and was unbinding his mother whom he had rescued as well. I wasn't sure if I would make it in time. As he stared up at the other boy in wonder, he heard something behind him. When he turned to see what the commotion behind him was, he saw that it was 2 more Narutos who were beating the crap out of the men who had taken his mother. Seems you really do have a backbone, kid. Naruto, or was it another one of his clones? Said as he patted him on the head. Moments after the fight started, the 2 men who had taken his mother were down on the ground, bruised, bleeding, and unconscious, brought low by someone who was only half their size. Seeing them in this state, he realized that they were not the insurmountable obstacles he had at first thought them to be. It was as Naruto had said earlier, they were only strong as long as you did nothing. In that case, he would make everyone do something, and they would take the strength away from the biggest of the monsters. He would rally everyone, and have them fight. This was their home, and Gato couldn't have it. Where are you going? Naruto asked when he turned back to the house to grab any weapons he could find. I'm going to get everyone, and we'll get Gato together," he replied. "Well, in that case, I think I'll help. It's better than just hanging around here looking after you guys," Naruto replied. "Besides, I will be needing to tell the villagers what areas to avoid if Boss and the others fail at the bridge, and it comes down to a street fight." Naruto watched as Sasuke became trapped in an unknown jutsu that involved sheets of ice. Within the jutsu, the boy with the name that was very familiar for some reason was peppering Sasuke with Saban. He knew for a fact that the boy was deadly accurate with those things since he had paralyzed his master with them by unerringly throwing them at points that were very close to spots that would have been fatal, which made this activity more puzzling, unless the boy wasn't actively trying to kill Sasuke. Outside of the fight between Sasuke and Zabuza's accomplice, there was a virtual standstill as they stood facing Zabuza, who had yet to make a move. Why were their opponents not actively trying to kill them? He knew that part of the reason that Zabuza hadn't tried to kill them was because Kakashi was keeping Zabuza in check in regards to Tazuna, and Zabuza was keeping Kakashi in check in regards to Sasuke. In that fight, either would move until one or the other was certain of their advantage, which was the reason why Zabuza currently wasn't trying to turn them into sashimi with that sword. Sasuke's opponent, however. There was no reason for Zabuza's accomplice to spare Sasuke, no reason at all. He had him completely outclassed in that jutsu, and could have ended it all in the first strike. Instead of killing him right away, however, he was giving Sasuke a very slow death with 1,000 paper cuts and every opportunity to figure out a way to defeat his opponent. As he watched the fight, trying to figure out what Zabuza's accomplice was up to, Sakura went over and tossed a kunai to Sasuke, who had dropped his in the boy Haku's initial attack. The kunai didn't reach its intended recipient, however, because Haku went through the other side of one of the mirrors he'd rather foolishly assumed had been one way and caught the thrown weapon before it could reach Sasuke. This gave him the first bit of good news he'd had throughout the entire battle. If Zabuza's apprentice was forced to fight on both sides of the mirrors, there would be an increased chance of the boy making a mistake that would allow them to defeat him. With that in mind, he made his way over to the unusual jutsu that was a result of a Kekkai Genkai in which Sasuke was trapped, hoping that Sakura and Kakashi would be enough to protect Tazuna should Zabuza finally decide that attacking would be to his advantage. When he reached the dome of ice mirrors, he circled it looking for any weaknesses. There were none that he could see. After his first circuit, he decided to check the strength of the mirrors themselves. As he was powering up one of his wind jutsu, Zabuza threw several shuriken at him, which Haku knocked off course with several samban. "Please let me deal with them, Zabuza-sama," the boy named Haku said as the shuriken clattered to the ground. "Fine, Haku, go ahead," Zabuza replied before turning back to his standoff with Kakashi. Sasuke took the opportunity to attack since Haku was distracted with him, but it didn't do him much good since the boy hadn't been nearly as distracted as he had seemed, and he intercepted Sasuke's attack and made yet another attack on Sasuke. In this attack, Sasuke was hit by about 1,000 more samban, and yet again the needles caused minimal damage, slicing here, scraping there, none of them stabbing into the boy, who looked a bit like a pincushion. During Haku's attack on Sasuke, he attacked one of the mirrors with the wind jutsu he'd been in the middle of forming when Zabuza had thrown his shuriken, and it did not break. It didn't even so much as crack. The Zabuza's accomplice responded to this attack by sending a volley of samban in his direction, while tossing yet another one at Sasuke. Undaunted, he attacked the mirror again at the same point that he had attacked it before, hoping to further weaken it. Nothing. He attacked it again. Still nothing. Inside the mirrors, Sasuke used one of his fireball jutsu. The mirror that it hit briefly started to melt by the time the fireball had burned itself out, and rapidly reformed shortly after it had done so. He attacked the mirror that took the brunt of Sasuke's attack, hoping that the melting and reformation of the mirror had weakened it somehow. Nothing there either. Realizing that he was getting nowhere, he decided to use the strongest of his small arsenal of wind jutsu on the mirrors, despite the fact that he only had it half-mastered and Tetsuo Sensei would have given him hell for using a jutsu he hadn't fully mastered in battle. After making the seals for the Kazakiri no Jutsu, he launched the blade of wind at the mirror closest to him. It barely made a dent. "Why do you try so hard to defend him?" the boy Haku asked. "Is he precious to you?" "No," he replied honestly. But my mother and the Yondaime entrusted me with the protection of Konoha and its citizens before they died, and they are precious to me. I will not let anyone from Konoha be harmed if there is anything I could do to prevent it. I will not let them down. I too have someone I need to protect, the boy said. Being a shinobi is difficult for me, and I do not want to kill you, but I will kill my heart and be a shinobi in order to protect my precious person. He has entrusted his dreams to me, and I will not let him down either. I'm sorry. With that, the boy started to attack Sasuke once more. There was nothing he could do about it from out here but try to break the jutsu since the boy was moving far too fast. Perhaps, he sent a number of Kage Bunshin into the jutsu to assist Sasuke. They were promptly dispelled, but Zabuza's accomplice had been distracted from Sasuke while they lasted. Hoping to keep the masked boy distracted, he sent in another wave while he attempted to break one of the mirrors with an explosive tag. The mirror yet again refused to break. Hearing some sort of commotion behind him, he turned to look. While he'd been focused on freeing Sasuke, the standoff between Kakashi and Zabuza had finally heated up into a battle. Chapter 11 Wave Battle on the Bridge 2. Why? Sasuke asked as he watched the masked boy decimate wave after wave of that boy's Kage Bunshin. There were several questions that were running through his mind, and they all boiled down to one: why? Why hadn't the boy killed him earlier? Why wasn't this boy making a serious effort to kill him even now? He had him at his mercy, and yet he still held back. Why was he toying with him in this manner? I was like you once, the masked boy said as he moved from mirror to mirror. I lost my precious people when my father killed my mother and tried to kill me. At those words, a memory that was always close to the surface yet again came unbidden, a memory of the day he had lost all who were precious to him. He had come home late from training. The Uchiha district had been totally silent. Unnaturally so. He came across the first of the bodies on one of the side streets after he turned off the main road to say goodnight to his aunt whose light was still on his way home. The main path through the district which led to his house had been completely devoid of corpses, as if it had been deliberately swept clear, but, as he continued to explore, he soon discovered that there were more dead littering the alleys and byways of the Uchiha district, a lot more. After finding what had to be at least half the clan lying dead in what seemed to be oceans of blood, he ran fearfully through the silent streets that were littered with the bodies of his kin, dreading what he'd find at home. After what seemed like an eternity, he finally reached the house his family shared. It was dark and completely silent inside and out, as unnaturally silent as the district had been. Fearing what he would find, he ran through the empty halls frantically searching for his parents and his older brother. Inside his parents' bedroom was. The bodies of his parents lay in a heap on the floor, one on top of the other. There was a pool of blood around them, and spatters of blood staining the walls. His parents were dead, and he could sense that he wasn't alone in the room. There was someone hiding in the shadows, possibly the same someone who had murdered his parents. As he stood there uncertain whether to fight or flee, the person moved out of the shadows. It was Itachi. The masked boy continued his story, drawing him out of his flashback as he sent another volley of saban in his direction, forcing him to dodge. My family had been a poor but happy and loving one that had lived on a small farm in water country, the boy said as the saban sailed through the air. My mother, however, had had a secret that ended up destroying everything when it was discovered. Before I was born, there had been a long and bloody civil war in which those with Kekkai Genkai came to be feared and reviled for having been on the front lines slaughtering thousands upon thousands, shinobi and civilian alike. After the war, having a Kekkai Genkai was basically an automatic death sentence in water country. Despite being a civilian, my mother had been born with a Kekkai Genkai that she had struggled to keep hidden. The boy continued as he settled himself into another mirror and launched another volley of saban. My mother's Kekkai Genkai had been passed down to me, and one day I discovered my powers and showed them to my mother, not knowing the danger they represented. Unbeknown to either of us, my father had witnessed this. That evening, he and several others from the nearby village came to our home and killed my mother. After they had killed her, my father moved to kill me. I blacked out after that, but when I came to, I learned that I killed my own father. The boy continued as he continued to flash from mirror to mirror, taking out that boy's Kage Bunshin at a rate that was becoming just the tiniest bit easier to see. It was then that I discovered that loneliness, the feeling of being unwanted, unneeded by anyone, of not having a purpose, was the worst feeling in the world. The boy said after he'd taken out another batch of that boy's kage Bunshin as that boy uselessly hammered away at the mirrors from the outside. I was starving on the streets alone for a long time until Zabuza-sama found me. The boy continued as he made an attack that prevented him from exiting the mirrors after he thought he'd seen a perfect opening. He had need of me and my powers which everyone else feared. He took me in, and I became his tool, his weapon, an extension of his will, and anything he asks of me, I will do, even if I have to destroy my own heart to do so. The boy finished as he made an attack on that boy who had apparently done something that had rattled one of the mirrors, and that boy went down with several sanbans sticking out of him. Hearing that story, he had to admit that he and the masked boy were alike in some ways, and he could see how the boy could feel sympathy for him because he could understand his pain better than most. Both of them had had someone they had loved and trusted to protect them destroy their family. Both of them had been left completely alone in the world afterward. Of course, that didn't make him stop resenting the other boy who continued to attack him, or stop the other boy from attacking him though. It did, however, make him wonder how his life could have turned out if he hadn't had a need to avenge his clan to drive him. If he had absolutely nothing left after that man had killed his clan, would he have been the same? Would he have completely subsumed his will to that of the first person that had need of him who came along? He was rather quickly pulled out of his musings because the boy's attacks became even more serious after he finished his story, apparently having reminded himself exactly why he was fighting. Instead of the usual tiny slices, the sanban were starting to stab into his body, but he could see. He could see every move the other boy made. Was this the Sharingan? Had he finally activated it? Kakashi knew he was growing tired but did his best to not let it show lest Zabuza spotted and exploited this weakness. He had lost a great deal of blood as he made the moves that would put his opponent into check. Fortunately, he wasn't alone in his exhaustion. He could tell that his opponent was becoming exhausted as well, as the unnatural mist had begun to clear because his opponent was unable to continue pumping chakra into it. If his opponent was as exhausted as he appeared, it meant that he would be slower than normal. Good. It was time to finish this. Prepping the field for his finishing move, he pulled out the scroll he used to summon his pack and put blood on it before resealing it and pressing it into the surface of the bridge. Beneath him, his pack of nin dogs made their way to Zabuza, broke through the surface of the bridge, and immobilized the man. After exchanging the usual battle banter, which he could afford to do now that his opponent was immobilized, he powered up a Raikiri. Before he could move forward and impale the swordsman of the mist with it, however, an ice mirror formed right next to him, and several sanban went flying. Due to his exhaustion, which wasn't being helped by the Raikiri that was eating his chakra like crazy, he wasn't as quick as usual, and he failed to dodge. After being impaled by the sanban, he fell to the ground unable to move. Fortunately, his dogs had dealt with Zabuza's arms, so, unless Zabuza's accomplice who had so far shown Sasuke and Naruto mercy Sasuke twice had decided to finish him off, there was a good chance he would live. Behind him he could hear a scream of Kakashi. And he could feel a familiar chakra rising, a chakra he had not felt in over 12 years. Naruto's seal was breaking. Everything went black. Momochi Zabuza growled in frustration at the situation he had found himself in. Hatake Kakashi the copy nin was lying on the ground in front of him, and he couldn't do anything to make sure he was finished off thanks to the dogs that were pinning him in place. The one good thing about this situation, however, was that Haku had yet again arrived in the nick of time to save his hide. That boy was more than worth all of the time and effort he had spent on him. Kakashi was down, possibly permanently, but there was a more immediate threat to deal with. There was a new player on the battlefield, a powerful new player. The malevolent chakra he had sensed shortly after the copy ninja had fallen to Haku's sanban continued to rise with each passing second. Who or whatever it was could be a serious danger to him. Suddenly, there was a yell to his left, and the blonde Inuzuka boy was racing up to him. As the boy approached, the dogs that had been holding him immobile scattered in all directions with their tails between their legs. He himself barely had time to register the fact that the boy had transformed when he came barreling into him on all fours. As his mind desperately scrabbled to find out what the hell was going on, the clawed and fanged boy with the slit-pupiled red eyes sent him flying and attacked him again. Haku tried to defend him, and got attacked himself for his troubles. After the boy incapacitated Haku, he focused on him once more, barreling into him, and trying to slice him open with his claws. All he could think the entire time this was happening was holy shit. This had most definitely not been how he'd planned for this attack to go. For the second time in Uzumaki Naruto's life, he was seeing red. That boy Haku had taken out Kakashi, and it was all that Zabuzagai's fault. He'd heard that Haku boy's story, and knew that if that Zabuzagai hadn't made Haku fight, then he wouldn't have and Kakashi would have been fine. He was going to kill him. He was going to kill the both of them. He attacked Zabuza first because he was the one responsible, the one who had been actively trying to kill Kakashi while Haku had been trying to spare him and Sasuke. As he was dealing with the man, Haku tried to attack him. The key word there being tried. He swiftly dealt with Haku and turned back to Zabuza, intent on tearing him apart. As he was about to land the final blow on that Zabuzagai, he smelled danger. Had the Haku boy gotten up? He whirled around in the direction the scent had originated. It wasn't the Haku boy. There was someone else here. No, several someones. He smelled sweat, unwashed bodies, and steel. Lots and lots of steel. There was an army somewhere nearby. How pathetic! Someone he couldn't yet see said. I had hoped you would be able to take the other ninja with you before I took you out, but clearly the demon of the mist isn't all he's cracked up to be. Demon? Pa! More like a minor imp at best. You got brought down by a little kid. He didn't like that voice. There was something wrong about it. Something that reminded him of every unpleasant person he'd run into in his entire life. I should have sent my mercenaries in the first place, since you obviously couldn't get the job done. The person said as the mist that had been obscuring his vision faded. The mist cleared completely, revealing a short, stocky, grayish-brown-haired man in a suit and sunglasses with a cane standing at the head of a small army. He could have sworn he'd seen the man before somewhere, but he couldn't place him. The men standing behind the man were armed to the teeth with a wide variety of weapons which ranged from swords to pikes. Kill the survivors, then move on to the village. The people there need to be taught a lesson. The man at the head of the group, whom he finally realized was the businessman Gato whose picture he'd seen in the paper, said, Kill the survivors? But Sasuke and Sakura and Tazuna were the survivors, and he had sworn to protect them, and he never went back on his word. There was no way in hell he would let that happen. There was no way he would let the man who had ordered Zabuza to kill Kakashi take out the rest of his team. The red haze that had been gradually fading overtook him once more, growing deeper until there was nothing left but red. Sasuke couldn't quite process what he was seeing. It had started when the masked boy had left the mirrors entirely in the middle of a battle that had been entirely in his favor for some reason, and less than a minute later the mirrors all shattered, freeing him. Despite the fact that he had been freed, he could do nothing more than sit and watch what happened next, because the masked boy's Senbon seriously restricted his mobility and prevented him from doing much else. The first thing he saw after the mirrors shattered was the masked boy lying on the ground. The second was Kakashi, obviously having been taken out by the swordsman Zabuza. The third was that boy tearing the swordsman apart. Then, someone else arrived, someone who had been at the head of an armed mob. It was what happened next after the mercenaries had shown up that he had been unable to process. After the man at the head of the mob had ordered the mob to kill them, that boy changed as he raced towards the men on all fours. As the boy sped towards the group, a strange red energy started bubbling up from that boy, and surrounded him, a strange red energy that caused an ominous feeling to wash over him even where he sat so far away from the coming action. The first thing that boy did when he reached the group was grab the ankle of the fleeing leader, pull him towards him, and tear his throat out. As soon as the leader was dead, he then started on the mob. One man impaled that boy with a spear, and he pulled it out and continued attacking as if nothing had even happened. The wound that the spear had made closed before his very eyes. After the grievous wound that had been caused by the spear had healed, that boy then started cutting a swathe through the group of mercenaries. The men soon began to break ranks and flee when they realized that their weapons were ineffective. That boy would just keep pulling them out, and continue fighting while his wounds healed right before their very eyes. Heedless of the damage he caused as well as the damage that was caused to him, that boy chased the men as they fled over the side of the bridge. What was that boy? He couldn't possibly be human. Naruto! Someone behind him called, gaining his and everyone else's attention. As he watched, that boy turned away from the slaughter and raced over towards the source of the voice, which turned out to belong to Tazuna's small grandson, who was at the head of a mob of locals armed with tools and farming equipment. As that boy moved past him, he could see that he had somehow grown claws and fangs, and that the strange marks on his face had grown larger and more feral looking. There was something else as well. That boy's eyes weren't blue, they were red. Naruto! The Tazuna's grandson cried out when that boy was almost on top of him. That boy reached up to attack, but stopped before he landed the final blow. The ominous red energy that boy emitted began to dissipate. The claws shrank back into nails, and the marks turned back into lines. The fangs presumably vanished as well. "Hey Inari," that boy said. "Sorry about that." Just what in the hell was Uzumaki Naruto? As Naruto spoke with Inari and the mob of villagers who had come with him, Haku had slowly made his way to his fallen master's side. Finally, after what seemed like forever, he reached him. He was weak, in pain, and quite possibly bleeding internally as well as externally, but that didn't matter. Only Zabuza-sama mattered. Zabuza-sama was alive. Barely. He had lost far more blood than was healthy, and would continue to lose even more if he didn't do something. Using one of the few healing jutsu he knew, he pushed his chakra into Zabuza-sama until he was about to pass out. There was a good chance that he wouldn't wake up because he had used up so much of his chakra. There was also a chance that Zabuza-sama would die despite his ministrations as well. He would cross that bridge later when he came to it though. His last thought as his consciousness faded was, if Zabuza-sama dies, then I don't want to wake up. Chapter 12 Wave, Aftermath. Kakashi groaned when yet another person came to his room in Tazuna's home asking for advice. It was the morning after a major battle. He was suffering from several injuries as well as chakra exhaustion up the wazoo, and he just wanted to sleep. Unfortunately, he had been unable to get any of that sleep he so desperately needed because the nice townsfolk of the village that surrounded Wave's main port kept coming in and bothering him. Things would have been much easier if Momochi Zabuza and that boy Haku had died on the bridge. He was still thanking his lucky stars that Haku wasn't quite the merciless killer that Zabuza had portrayed him to be. Instead of being worm food like he'd half expected to end up being when he'd fallen unconscious, he was going to be laid up for about a week before going home from yet another crappy mission. Of course, prospect of the week's inactivity really sucked because he hated being inactive. When Naruto had learned that he was still alive, and had merely been paralyzed by Haku's Senban, he had ordered the mob of townspeople who had shown up a little too late to drive Gato and his forces out to spare the boy and the swordsman who had been laying unconscious in the middle of a damaged section of bridge. Rather than being torn apart by an angry mob as they would have otherwise been, the two were taken prisoner and dragged off to the town doctor to be fixed up before they were dealt with. The two of them received slightly more sympathy from the townspeople than they would have had when Naruto had revealed that Gato had planned on betraying them and killing them once they had completed the mission for which they'd been hired. Not much more than a little though. Now that they had them, the townspeople wanted to know what to do with the two missing nin, and had turned to him for advice since he was the highest-ranked ninja in the region. Dealing with Haku and Zabuza was a slightly sticky and problematic situation. The townspeople would not be able to keep the two locked up indefinitely as, when they finally recovered from their injuries, they would be able to easily make their escape. They weren't going to be executed either, as Naruto, who was currently the hero of the hour despite his littler outburst, had pled for clemency, and the townsfolk had kindly granted it. They couldn't just let the two go on their way, however, and reporting them to the Kirigakure hunter nin would just result in their executions, so they couldn't really do that either. He knew that bringing the two of them to Konoha would be a headache and a half for an entirely different set of reasons from the ones that were plaguing the people of Wave, even if they didn't escape or even try to escape while being transported. Momochi Zabuza was infamous for his attempted assassination of the yondaime Mizuki Jigura, and having him in Konoha would spark a diplomatic incident with Kiri which Konoha really didn't need at all. Relations were still frosty after that incident with Naruto during last year's Winter Chunin exam, and the reason there hadn't been any sanctions was the fact that Kiri couldn't prove that A. Naruto was a Jinchuriki, and B. that Naruto had been sent to Kiri with malicious intentions on Konoha's part. So, thanks to the fact that Haku and Zabuza had survived, they were stuck in a catch-22. They couldn't keep Zabuza and his accomplice, and they couldn't get rid of them either. Well, technically they could get rid of them, but Naruto would kick up one heck of a fuss which would result in another set of problems. Relations between him and Naruto were bad enough, and he didn't need to bring something like that between the two of them on top of everything else. He really wasn't in the mood for this. He was going to do what he should have done from the beginning and say screw it before kicking this upstairs for the Hokage deal with as soon as he could summon a messenger. Let the Hokage take the fallout. He deserved it, for whatever, the Hokage deserved it. Inari watched in mixed revulsion and satisfaction as the townspeople burned Gato's body. The monster that had haunted his nightmares was dead and gone, brought down by a monster that was also a hero. A good person who'd turned out to be more than he'd appeared had done something, and the evil one that had been given strength through the inaction of others who'd turned out to be weaker than everyone had thought him to be had been destroyed. Thanks to Naruto, both his mother and his grandfather were still alive. Rather than say that the enemy was too strong, Naruto had faced down an entire army and had fought to save everyone, even though he would almost certainly have been killed. And, like in the stories, the hero had been given great strength, defeated the monster, sent the villain's forces fleeing, and saved everyone. Well, almost everyone. Some of the construction workers hadn't survived the battle that had raged around them after Gato's ninja had attacked. The thing that mattered most now though was that wave was free, thanks to Naruto. Even though he should be back at Tazuna's resting, Naruto sat at Haku's bedside and studied the other boy's face as he slept. Dr. Yoshida had taken the boy's mask off when he had been brought in for treatment, and he'd immediately noticed that the boy had very feminine features. He'd also had the niggling feeling that he'd seen him before somewhere, as he looked at the boy's exceedingly feminine face which would likely plague him into adulthood. Because that feeling had bothered him like an itch he couldn't scratch, he racked his brain trying to figure out where it could have been that he'd seen the boy before. Finally, it came to him. The boy looked just like a very nice girl he'd once met. He was seated on a worn stool in front of the counter of a slightly run-down ramen stand in a foreign village. The nice girl who had led him here was seated next to him. They had introduced themselves to each other as they waited for the old man to finish making their ramen. Her name was Haku, which was rather strange since that was a boy's name. "Tell me," the girl asked slightly nervously. "Do you have someone precious to you? Someone that you would do anything to protect?" He had been so nice to him back then, had been one of the very few good things that had happened to him in Kiri. He'd almost forgotten him, in all the general unpleasantness that had occurred later, and now, he'd almost killed him. He had completely lost control of himself, and had almost killed someone who had shown him nothing but kindness and mercy. He had almost killed a friend of his as well yesterday. Inari would have died if he hadn't regained control of himself at the last second. Morishita-san had warned him that something like this would happen if he let his rage control him after the first time this had happened, when he was in Kiri. She had told him to rein in his temper and find a safe outlet for it. He apparently hadn't. He had lost control again, and had let even more of the fox out, the fox that his mother and the yondaime had trusted him to keep sealed away. He had failed them. As he wallowed in his guilt as he waited for Haku to wake, the Zabuza guy groaned from the other bed in Dr. Yoshida's small clinic. He had just returned to consciousness, and was undoubtedly in a massive amount of pain. It had been touch and go with him last night, and his survival had not been certain. He had pulled through, however, and, if his wounds didn't get infected or something, he should survive. They had nearly lost Haku due to his injuries and the chakra exhaustion last night as well, and he was still in danger until he woke up. The two of them wouldn't have been in nearly as bad a condition as they were currently in if he hadn't completely lost it. It was one thing to kill your enemies in battle, it was something else entirely when you lose it, almost kill your enemies, and become a danger to everyone around you, including your allies, like he had done. If he didn't find a way to stay in control of himself during these kinds of situations, one of the dead was going to end up being a friend or a teammate someday. Sakura stood outside the town's small, rundown medical building, uncertain about whether she should go inside or not. Naruto was inside, and she wasn't certain if she was ready to face him yet. What she had seen yesterday had really shaken her. Naruto had snapped. Naruto had more than snapped, Naruto had turned into a monster. What had happened to the nice, cheerful but annoying boy that she had remembered from the academy? Had he always been like this? Is this why everyone avoided him and told their children not to play with him? She had heard of Kekkai Genkai before, but none of the ones in Konoha that she'd heard about matched what she had seen. His mother had been a foreigner, though. His mother had come from here, in fact. The doctor who ran the clinic was old, probably old enough to remember Naruto's family. Maybe she would know whether or not Naruto had a whirlpool Kekkai Genkai. With her mind finally made up, she finally entered the building. The doctor was sitting in a chair resting, having spent the night tending to her 2 patients who had been in critical condition when they arrived. The 2 patients were occupying beds at either end of the room, and Naruto was sitting next to the boy's bed, watching the boy with a serious expression on his face. "Yoshida-san?" she said, trying to get the doctor's attention. "I was wondering if I could ask you a question." She was slightly uncertain about asking with Naruto present, but it was probably better than going behind his back. If Naruto objected to the question, he could ask the doctor not to answer it, but she really wanted to know the answer, however. "What is it?" Dr. Yoshida asked tiredly, sitting up straighter in the chair she had been slumped in. "Well, I was wondering if you knew if the Uzumaki had a Kekkai Genkai. What Naruto did yesterday didn't match any of the Konoha Kekkai Genkai I've heard about," she replied, almost timidly. "The Uzumaki were famous for their red hair, their sealing skills, and living to a very ripe old age, but I don't think that those were Kekkai Genkai." "Why?" Dr. Yoshida replied after a minute of thought. "Well, yesterday, Naruto grew claws and fangs, and there was this strange red chakra surrounding him, and I thought it might be a Kekkai Genkai," she answered. "Jinchuriki." Momochi Zabuza moaned from his bed. Dr. Yoshida gasped at this, looking shocked and sickened. "What's Jinchuriki?" she asked. "About the most horrible thing anyone could do to a child," Dr. Yoshida replied. "To make a Jinchuriki, you seal one of the biju into a living child, usually an infant, since the beast's chakra would normally kill an adult. The Jinchuriki are used as weapons by their village." "I'm not a weapon," Naruto growled from where he sat by Haku, apparently having listened to the entire conversation despite the rapt attention he seemed to be paying the unconscious boy. "My mom and the Yondaime sealed the fox inside me to keep Konoha safe. They wanted me to protect everyone from it." A pain-filled "holy shit" came from Zabuza's direction. Sasuke froze with his back against the wall. He had been standing by the open window of the clinic providing extra security in case one of the injured ninja decided to take one of the more popular hospital exits in an attempt to escape. What he just heard. That boy had the Kyuubi sealed inside him. The Kyuubi that had vanished after Uchiha Madara had used it in his battle against the Shodai Hokage at the Valley of the End, and had reappeared 12 years ago only to be disposed of by the Yondaime who had given his life to do so, disposed of on the day that boy had been born. He remembered asking his father how the Kyuubi had died after he'd heard the rather sketchy story that had been told to his entire year during a special assembly that had taken place on the Yondaime's birthday during his first year at the academy. He'd asked his father because he thought he would know how the Kyuubi had been killed because the academy instructor who told the story had refused to tell them how the Yondaime had killed the Kyuubi. In fact, the man yelled at that boy for asking when he had told the combined classes the tale of the Yondaime's sacrifice for the village. When he'd asked, his father had looked like he'd been about to say something about it, but he suddenly changed his mind and told him not to ask ever again, that the Yondaime had defeated the Kyuubi, and that was all he needed to know about the subject. Had his father known about Naruto? Had that academy instructor known? And if they had known, who else knew, and why hadn't they shared their knowledge? Zabuza had heard the rumors of the Kyuubi Jinchuriki that had been cropping up lately, but hadn't put much stock in them, as there had not even been a whisper about a Kyubi Jinchuriki in the generations since the Jinchuriki first started being made. The rumors had started after some sort of incident that took place during the Chunin exams over a year ago. Supposedly, according to the rumors he'd heard, the Kyubi Jinchuriki was a small blonde boy. A blonde boy, like the one that had nearly taken him out on the bridge. The existence of the Jinchuriki had not been confirmed, until now that is. He had nearly been killed by, and was currently lying helpless in the same room as the Kyubi Jinchuriki who was sitting by the bedside of Haku who was also helpless. He should have followed that damn fortune-teller's advice and not accepted any business contracts on that day. But no, he had to go and accept Gado's offer, and look where it had gotten him. He'd been betrayed by his employer before he could betray the man, was down 2 followers, was badly injured, and was the prisoner of a bunch of Konoha shinobi, one of which was Sharingan Kakashi, and another of which was the Kyubi Jinchuriki who he hadn't believed in. To make matters worse, he had done all that work and nearly gotten himself killed twice in order to get funds for another coup attempt, and he hadn't seen a single ryo for his effort. Today really sucked. In fact, the entire week had blue chunks. Chapter 13 Wave, Aftermath 2. Kakashi felt like slamming his head against the nearest wall, and probably would have if he could get up to do so. Thanks to someone's boneheaded stupidity, he now had to explain the Sandame's law to one of his students who happened to be one of the biggest gossips in Konoha. As if things hadn't been going badly enough already, Naruto had let the cat out of the bag with the help of Momochi Zabuza and a doctor who knew way too much about Jinchuriki for her own good. He could probably try to have Zabuza executed on the grounds of knowing classified information, but that would be flimsy at best and Naruto probably knew it. Because as far as Kiri and therefore Zabuza were concerned, that particular cat had been out of the bag and running around the house for over a year. The fact that Zabuza had said Jinchuriki in speculation according to witness accounts rather than saying Naruto is the Kyubi Jinchuriki was a pesky technicality that might protect him from the Sandame's law, which probably couldn't be enforced in his case anyway because he wasn't a citizen of Konoha but probably could considering the fact that he was currently a prisoner of Konoha's forces and therefore under their jurisdiction until he was either executed or repatriated. He could still kill the demon of the mist over it, but Naruto would raise an almighty stink and relations between the two of them were cool enough already because he was a villain in Naruto's eyes for taking him from a teacher he'd grown attached to. Kill 2 more people that Naruto was attached to, and he'd most likely end up being dead to the boy. He couldn't teach his sensei's son if the boy completely disavowed his existence. He would have to consult with the Hokage on that, and see what he thought when he summoned his messenger. As far as he was concerned, the Hokage could be the villain in this situation and sort this whole Zabuza mess out. And the sooner he did it, the better. He would be able to summon a messenger to send a report back to Konoha tomorrow, or the next day at the latest. He planned on summoning a Hei as he was his fastest runner. His day had been completely screwed an hour earlier when he'd been trying to sleep and Sakura had come in asking about Jinchuriki and Naruto in particular. He'd been forced to explain that yes, a 20-story tall fox made entirely of chakra had been sealed into Naruto on the day he had been born, and that no, Naruto wasn't usually a danger to himself or others, had not been since day one, and no, Naruto hadn't known about the Kyubi himself until recently. Before he could get a word in edgewise about the Sandame's law regarding the subject, she'd left the room to go and do whatever. Sasuke had come in after he dozed off again and further ruined his day by demanding information about the Uzumaki. He found it rather odd that the boy didn't know anything more about Uchiha Madara and his ability to control the Kyubi than what any school child knew, which was that the man had used the creature in a battle with the Shodai Hokage at the Valley of the End where he died. His clan and the law had apparently kept the boy sheltered against the suspicions against the Uchiha in regards to the Kyubi's attack. Fortunately, Sasuke had stuck around for a brief overview of the law and the reasons surrounding it as that was part of the information he wanted to know. If it had been merely for Naruto's sake, the law wouldn't have required such a draconian punishment. The identities of the Kyubi Jinchuriki had been closely guarded secrets in Konoha for generations. The first Jinchuriki had been rumored to have been the Shodai Hokage's wife Senju, née Uzumaki, Mido, but that had never been confirmed or denied. There had been rumors amongst the older generations that Hashirama and Mito's 2 children had had whisker marks on their cheeks like Naruto's, but that couldn't be confirmed, though they had always been wearing heavy makeup in the few surviving photographs there were of them. Someone had obviously taken Mito's place as Jinchuriki if she had been one in the first place, since she died long before the Kyuubi attack, but it was not known, at least to the majority of the village at large, exactly who. There had been some whispers about Kushina-san that everyone in the know had refused to confirm or deny, though. He knew he should have listened to his horoscope when it said that any journeys undertaken on that day would be filled with misfortune. He had been attacked, stabbed, practically sliced open, nearly drowned, paralyzed, suffered from chakra exhaustion twice, and now was forced to explain to the kiddies exactly why they couldn't tell their friends about Naruto's status as a Jinchuriki, and also be forced to explain to the Hokage that they knew, and exactly why they knew. And here he thought he'd be taking a nice little seaside vacation. This mission completely blew. Sakura wasn't sure how she should feel about Naruto, but she could understand how he came to be the way he was. Someone had taken an infant on the day it was born and, in a completely monstrous act, had sealed a demon inside of it with the consent of at least one of its parents. Just about everyone in the village who had been alive and able to understand what was going on at the time knew about this, and hated Naruto because of it. Naruto had grown up completely alone without either of his parents, who had also died in the Kyuubi's attack like so many other people had done that day. He'd been unloved, unwanted, and uncared for, and before he could make any friends, the adults had poisoned their children against him. It was the perfect conditions to make a monster, and yet, Naruto wasn't one, not exactly. If Naruto had truly been a monster, he would have killed her or really broken her arm instead of merely threatening to do so when she had attacked him that day at the academy. If Naruto had truly been a monster, he would have killed everyone on that bridge when he had lost control instead of just Gado's men. If Naruto had truly been a monster, he would not have cared about this place or its people in the first place, and therefore wouldn't have even bothered with the battle. If Naruto had truly been a monster, he would not have cared if his teammates lived or died and wouldn't have taken their survival into consideration. If Naruto had truly been a monster, he would not have sworn to protect Konoha either. While Naruto just barely kept a monster contained, Naruto himself was not a monster. What would her life have been like if the yondaime had asked her parents for permission instead of Naruto's? Would her parents have kept her despite the fact that the entire village would have hated her and wanted her gone? Would they have still loved her, or would they have feared her because of what she had kept contained? Would she have had any friends? Would she have managed to survive without friends the way Naruto had? Would she have viewed the protection of Konoha and its citizens as her responsibility the way Naruto had, despite the fact that most of them hated him, or would she have completely despised Konoha instead? Would she have been nearly as strong as Naruto was now? Would she have had his courage? Would she have had his empathy, and his sense of duty, or would she have become the monster many people seem to think Naruto is? Sasuke sat in a tree to think, as he often did when he had a thorny problem that couldn't be ignored which he had to sort out. The conversation he'd had with Kakashi had both been rather informative, and had brought up a slew of questions. While he'd been pumping Kakashi for information about that boy, Kakashi had been trying to weasel information out of him that he honestly didn't know and therefore couldn't give. Kakashi's offhand comment about rumors about his father and the Kyuubi confused and upset him. His father would never have done something like that. Konoha was his home, and several Uchiha had died that day defending Konoha from the fox. His father would never have senselessly thrown away the lives of any of the members of his clan. He could understand how a civilian might think that, though. Madara, who had been a Uchiha, had somehow controlled the Kyuubi and forced it to fight Senju Hashirama. People could then logically come to the assumption that Madara had passed the secret of how to do this on to the clan. If Madara had, however, he hadn't found it, and it definitely wasn't in the Uchiha's secret hiding place, as he'd already thoroughly searched it, looking for what that man had told him about. All he'd found down there was the secret of attaining the Mangekyo Sharingan and a bunch of maps with patrol routes on them that made absolutely no sense since they completely bypassed the worst parts of the village and heavily concentrated officers around the Hokage Tower, administration complex, and the shelter behind the Hokage monument. Another question that came to mind was why that boy? What had been so special about him that had made the yondaime pick him out of all of the infants in Konoha? Had it been because his parents had volunteered him before the yondaime could ask anyone else, or had it been for some other reason? He could have used power like that. He could have used it to completely destroy that man. He was a Uchiha and therefore should have been able to control the Kyuubi's powers the way Madara did somehow. He would have used the Kyuubi to turn that man into paste. But then again, the Shodai Hokage had taken control of the Kyuubi away from Madara, and killed him before he could get it back. There was a distinct possibility that that boy had been selected because he'd been born with whatever it was that had allowed the Shodai Hokage to seize control of the Kyuubi from Madara. If that were the case, that man could have found and used that boy if he'd had the Kyuubi sealed inside him instead of that boy, that infuriating boy who was so far ahead of him it wasn't even funny, that boy who would more than likely achieve his goal before he achieved his ambition. That boy had always been going on about being Hokage, even when he was in the academy. Did he know something everyone else didn't? Had he been groomed for the position from the start? According to history, and what he'd heard about the Uzumaki clan from Kakashi when the man had explained that Naruto hadn't really adopted him since the knowing consent of both parties was required or kids would be passed back and forth through several clans each time another kid unthinkingly loaned out their clothes as Naruto had done. The Uzumaki had been closely related to and intermarried with the Senju. 2 of the Hokage had been Senju, the 3rd had studied under both of the first 2 Hokage, and the 4th had studied under one of the 3rd's students. As that boy was related to the Senju, and on a team under the student of the yondaime, it would be logical to assume that he would be selected as the Sandaime's successor. Great. He'd been doing just about everything he could to alienate and piss off the next Hokage. Things were going to go real well for him when he restored his clan. Not. He now knew why Naruto had been placed on the team since it was glaringly obvious when you bothered to stop and think about it. He didn't bother to question why he was on the team as the answer to that question could be summed up in one word: Sharingan. Considering the fact that he was the last of the Uchiha besides that man, and that that boy was the future Hokage, what the hell was Sakura doing on the team? Haku groaned as he awoke, and winced as the light attacked his eyes as usual since, for some strange reason, his eyes became extremely light-sensitive when he suffered from chakra exhaustion. He could barely see, but he could tell that he was in a bed somewhere within the town that was located near the bridge, and that someone other than Zabuza-sama had brought him here, since Zabuza-sama was aware of his light sensitivity, and would never have stuck him next to an open window and left the blinds up. Had he completely failed Zabuza-sama? Had Zabuza-sama died? What would he do now that he'd failed? Pull the shades, the light's hurting the kid's eyes, said a voice that Haku had feared that he'd never hear again, cutting through his rising panic. As he nearly fainted in relief that he hadn't completely failed his master, someone hastily moved to close the blinds. He caught a flash of yellow, dark orange, and brown. Soon, the shades were drawn, and he was better able to focus on who it was. It was Naruto. While he was afraid of Naruto because of what the boy could do, he understood. He had seen the look of rage, pain, and grief that had been on the boy's face when he had transformed and attacked Zabuza-sama, when he believed that his sensei had been killed. If it had been Zabuza-sama who had been killed, or appeared to have been killed instead, he would have done the same thing. He couldn't call Naruto a monster because, what would that make him since he too had a Kekkai Genkai? And Naruto wasn't a monster, he hadn't killed indiscriminately, he had only killed those who had threatened him and his, albeit in a rather vicious manner. "I'm sorry, Haku," Naruto said sadly when he realized that he was looking at him. "Please forgive me." What reason did Naruto have to apologize to him? He'd done nothing but hurt the boy. He'd deceived him the day he met him, and used him as a distraction in order to escape. He'd wandered around the home of the boy's ancestors as if it were his own private playground without once paying his respects to them. He'd attacked the boy, attacked his teammates, and attacked his sensei, making him believe that he'd killed the man. What reason did Naruto have for begging his forgiveness? It should be the other way around, he should be the one begging Naruto for forgiveness. "I forgive you," he finally said after yanking himself out of his litany of the cruelties he had heaped upon the younger boy, seeing that his lack of an answer had caused the boy even more pain. Chapter 14, Wave, Clash of the ANBU. The Sandaime Hokage stared at the report that one of Kakashi's Niken had brought in, which sat innocuously at the edge of his desk as if it were a poisonous snake, almost afraid to open it and discover what sort of nightmare it contained. Reports were usually given at the end of a mission after everything was said and done, and everyone had all gone home either happy or dead depending on the type of mission assigned. When they arrived in the middle of a mission, it meant that something had gone very seriously wrong, and that someone needed to head out there post-haste to clean up the mess. He just knew that he really didn't want to find out what sort of mess Kakashi and his team could create in a week and a half though. What could go so wrong on a C-ranked mission that was basically little more than a glorified walk with a seaside vacation tacked onto the end of it that would result in a mid-mission report? The customer in question had been particularly trying, but not so much so that he'd be turned away for fear of his escort killing him before he reached his destination. Oh God, Sasuke hadn't snapped and killed the client, had he? Kakashi had been telling him that the boy had some anger issues, but he'd waved them off as not being too serious, as the boy had not been behaving overly aggressively. Knowing that he'd have to get it over with eventually and dreading what he would find, he carefully broke the seal on the scroll. After unfurling the scroll, he skimmed the document, stopped, and began to read it more thoroughly, hoping to all that was holy that he had misread what had been written while he'd been skimming the report. He hadn't. Naruto's curse had struck big time and the C rank had turned into an A rank, and then, when everyone had thought it was over, it had really hit the fan. There had been another incident with Naruto on the bridge, and there had been a large number of witnesses this time. Naruto's teammates were now aware of his status as the QB Jinchuriki. And to make matters worse, Kakashi had a pair of high-risk prisoners he didn't know what to do with, since Naruto had grown rather attached to one of them, making executing them rather problematic for the man whom Naruto had yet to warm up to. Damn. He knew that he wouldn't have wanted to know. Things would have been a whole lot easier if it had just been one of the genin snapping and killing the client. He could have found a way to sweep that under the rug at least. It had happened often enough over the years. As for the prisoners that Kakashi had taken, he could deal with those. He would send a team of ANBU to retrieve Zabuza and his young accomplice. That would give him time to figure out what he was going to do with them, and how to explain to Naruto exactly why he had to do what he had done afterward. Danzo choked slightly on his morning tea as he read the report he'd picked up after a nice relaxing 3-day weekend at a bed and breakfast in a nearby town. Things had been going slowly lately, so he had rather foolishly thought that he could take the time off to relax and not bother focusing on work as he had done for the last several decades. He'd thought he'd set everything up so that it would go smoothly without him there to supervise every little detail for a few days, but he was wrong. This was what he got for trying to take a vacation once in the nearly 60 years that he'd been a shinobi. Gato was dead, and without him there to hire thugs to threaten a few families and break a few bones when bribes didn't work, a number of stalled investigations into his businesses were now rapidly progressing. Because of this, he could stand to lose millions in funding for Root. Not only had he heavily invested in Gato's corporations and the man's less than legal activities, but Gato had hired a number of his operatives for some of his more clandestine operations. Without Gato to head Gato Corporation, the company was going to fall apart, especially after the results of the various investigations became public knowledge. Even if he managed to cash out all of his Gato Corporation stock, the price had already fallen to a point where it would be at a loss on his initial investment following the news of Gato's demise. Adding to this little shitfest was the fact that a thorn in his side that he thought Gato would deal with knowing the man's tendencies was still alive. Momochi Zabuza had the potential to become the Mizukage should he finally manage to get his coup off the ground. Unlike most potential Mizukage candidates, the man was ruthless and capable, and while he was willing to sell himself to the highest bidder to get the funds he needed, he was a staunch patriot in his own way. What's worse, the man had his own sense of honor that would preclude him dealing with him, and the loyalty of his followers even though he had flat out told them that they were nothing more to him than tools to help him reach his ambition. All in all, Momochi Zabuza not a good candidate for the position in his opinion. Kirigakure needed a relatively weak Mizukage so they would not be a threat to Konoha, and that was most definitely not Zabuza. Another person that was rapidly becoming a thorn in his side was the Jinchuriki. It was because of the boy that the most major problem that had cropped up during his short vacation that he wished he was back on, if only because he didn't want to deal with this mess. He had known that boy would be trouble the instant he saw the drooling bundle of joy who looked so much like his mother, who had been a headache and a half in his opinion. When he had seen him again with the boy who had taken him under his wing, he'd upwardly revised the amount of trouble the Jinchuriki would be. The reality, however, was turning out to be much worse. Rubbing his temples in order to ward off an impending headache, he called for several teams of root operatives whom he ordered to clear out all evidence of their dealings from Gato's holdings. He then called for a team which he then ordered to take out Zabuza before the man could escape and cause even more problems that he and Konoha didn't need. That team would of course be at a greater risk than the other one because they were going to be wearing the emblem of a foreign nation, so that the ANBU team that the Hokage had sent out wouldn't be alerted to Root's continued existence. Over in Water Country, the government in Kirigakure had been in complete disarray since the Yondaime Mizuki Jigura had bit the big one a few months back, and the Sanbai escaped its seal, cutting a swathe of destruction through the village on its way down to the sea. Considering the situation, it was completely understandable that the report regarding Zabuza's possible presence in Wave had gotten kicked around for a few weeks before it finally reached the Hunter Nin. After bouncing around several departments, the report finally reached the desk of a rather capable captain who had taken charge of the Hunter Nin until an acceptable candidate for the position of Godaime Mizukage could be found. After finishing the paperwork he had in front of him, he opened and read the report, swore at its age, and assigned a reasonably skilled team to check out Wave and see if Zabuza's trail could be picked up there. Momochi Zabuza had been a thorn in his backside for far too long. It is extremely fortunate for Zabuza that the squad leader of the ANBU that the Hokage had sent, who was codenamed Tenzo, had been a friend of Kakashi's when the other man had been in ANBU. Tenzo had hurried his team up a bit because he had wanted to make certain that Kakashi was really alright, and that extra bit of speed had meant that the Hokage's ANBU had managed to reach Zabuza first rather than the Kiri Hunter Nin or Root. Tenzo, who had been chosen for this mission because his Mokutan abilities would make the prisoner transfer process easier, had hurried his team because he was concerned for his old friend, since I'm Fine could cover a wide range of conditions with Hatake Kakashi, ranging from almost dead from blood loss and chakra exhaustion to actually being fine. And his teammates had been willing to go along with this because they were somewhat fond of the former ANBU captain as well. Without any griping from any of the team, who had all wanted to make sure that their senpai was well, they had made excellent time to the small port town in Wave. After checking in with Kakashi and catching up with him a bit, Tenzo had learned that the prisoners in question were at the town's medical clinic, where they were being seen to by the town's only doctor, and being guarded by Uzumaki Naruto, who had grown attached to Zabuza's young accomplice Haku, whom he'd apparently met during the Chunin exams in Kiri. Leaving Kakashi's side, he and his team swiftly made their way to the clinic to relieve the conflicted young genin who might end up making a mistake that would follow him for the rest of his career of his burdensome duty. As he and his team were securing the two mist ninja for transport, two teams of Hunter Nin from Kiri showed up. After trading a few hand signs, both teams started fighting each other. Tenzo wasn't sure which side to join in this matter. While only one of the groups were a legitimate team of Hunter Nin from Kiri, the other group that was fighting was using language from Konoha and therefore could be on a clandestine mission he'd not been informed of. The fact that he hadn't been informed of a mission that could potentially affect his own by the Hokage, no matter how clandestine, positively smacked of it being illicit. At this point, either group would be needing the aid of himself and his teammates. Should he aid the group from Konoha, whom he would have been told about if they had been on a legitimate mission, or should he aid the group from Kiri, since he'd more than likely have to arrest the group from Konoha since it wasn't supposed to be here? Perhaps the best solution in this case would be to deal with all of them and sort them out afterward. Genji had been a Hunter Nin close to 20 years. Having been a ninja for so long, he had worked alongside Zabuza for far longer than he'd hunted Zabuza, and knew exactly how tough the guy actually was. When he had been ordered to try and track the man in Wave, he had been understandably nervous. It was his duty to bring his former comrade in, however, and he was one of the best for the job to which he'd been assigned. When he and his team had arrived in Wave and learned that Zabuza was hanging around in the local hospital because he'd run afoul of a genin team from Konoha, he couldn't believe his luck. Actually, the first thing he couldn't believe was his ears. until someone had mentioned that Sharingan Kakashi was the instructor for that particular genin team and that the team had a Uchiha on it as well. When the team arrived at the hospital to retrieve their quarry, they arrived only to discover that their luck had not held. When they had reached the hospital, there had been an ANBU team from Konoha there preparing Momochi Zabuza and his accomplice for transport. Not only that, but there was another hunter team that he would have to share the credit with should they manage to wrest Zabuza away from the Konoha team hanging around as well. He could have sworn that the captain had only sent one team out because the lead was so old though. Just who the heck are you? He signed to the apparent leader of the hunter team that was trying to impose Kiri's claim over Zabuza, and not getting results. The response he got back was a rather shaky "Hi, I sent to help." While the relative uncertainty of that response would be understandable if the hunter nin in question were civilian-born, the leader of the other team had prefaced his statement with a gesture he knew was a Konoha swear. As a friend of his had made it his duty to learn the swear signs of every country, and had taught him a good number of them. The anger he'd been feeling when he'd realized that his team had arrived a little too late rose to murderous levels. The Konoha ninja he could ignore for the moment, since they didn't need that sort of mess, and the Konoha guys had gotten Zabuza fair and square. The other group, however, a bunch of fucking imposters, had been standing there trying to take the kill they would have snatched from the Konoha ninja if they had dropped their guard for even 1 second. Hopping mad at the imposters, he signaled his men to attack the fake hunter nin. He was Root, and he served Danzo-sama as an extension of his will for the good of Konoha. That was all he needed to know about himself. He had no need of emotions, and therefore swallowed the slight uncertainty he'd felt when a team of genuine Kirigakure hunter nin had shown up before the target could be eliminated. Had it just been the Konoha team that he needed to fool, things would have been fine, but now, he was not the best choice for this job. While he could almost perfectly imitate a Kiri hunter nin in movements, tone of voice, and accent, there was one flaw in his training. He was not fluent in Kiri. Much to his dread, which he rather swiftly buried as soon as it had appeared, the leader of the real team of Kirigakure hunter nin signed something that looked like an interrogative. The two most likely choices considering the situation were "Who are you?" and "Why are you here?" He hedged his bets and signed back with both his personal call sign and the answer as to why he would be here were he a real hunter nin from Kiri. He had apparently made a mistake, however, because the next thing he knew, he and his team were in a fight for their lives against the Kiri hunter nin. A few minutes later, the Konoha ANBU joined the fray, and he didn't know exactly which side they were on since they seemed to be fighting just about everyone. After the initial amazement at the ANBU fight that had suddenly erupted wore off and common sense stepped in, Naruto quickly got Zabuza and Haku under cover. At that moment, he didn't need anyone to tell him that, to put it politely, the fecal matter had hit the ventilation device. There were 3 teams of ANBU duking it out in the middle of the street, and anywhere near the immediate vicinity of that fight was most definitely not a good place for injured people, or anyone else for that matter to be. Kunai were flying everywhere, as were fireballs, and water jutsu, and defensive earth walls, and trees for some strange reason. And when he didn't think it could get any worse, the mist started up, obscuring the entire area and making it near impossible to see when to dodge. That didn't stop the fight, however, as he could still hear the clang of steel, the roar of fire and water, and the rumble of earth being torn from its moorings. What the hell was that all about? He wondered as the battle began to move off into the distance. After several long moments of struggle, Tenzo finally managed to wrap one of the fake Kiri hunter nin securely in the branches of his Mokutan technique, and bury him in the ground until only his head was showing. After the imposter was secure, he pulled off the man's mask. After studying the man's features, he realized that he didn't recognize him as a fellow ANBU or one of the rank and file, but noted that he resembled someone he had known during his days at the academy. There were several top-secret groups that were rumored to exist in Konoha, and it was possible that the man belonged to one of them. After memorizing the man's appearance, he rendered the man unconscious and drugged him for capture, hoping that he wasn't making a mistake in doing so, and that he hadn't harmed a fellow Konoha ninja who had been sent to help his team. He would have to report his findings to the Hokage, but it was possible that the man already knew. As soon as the fake hunter nin was dealt with, He moved back to the battle that was following the path of the retreating fake hunter Nin whose team his captive had been a member. He was Root, and he served Danzo as an extension of his will for the good of Konoha. He had failed. He had been captured and was unable to complete his objective. He knew what to do in case of capture. He bit down on a seal inside his cheek, and it released a small amount of a fast-acting poison into his system. It was enough. He was dead. Back at the main battle, the Kirigakure hunter Nin Genji hurled a kunai at one of the Konoha shinobi that chased him through the mist. It didn't matter to him whether it was one of the fake hunter Nin or the team of ANBU who had joined the fight, adding to the general confusion when they attacked both his team and the team of imposters. They were all the same as far as he was concerned. The kunai failed to hit its target, and he nearly received a fireball to the posterior courtesy of a katon jutsu in return. The way things were going, the battle was turning into little more than a farce as everybody tried to fight everybody else in what was rapidly becoming a free-for-all that was going in circles and causing a great deal of collateral damage and little else. To add to the confusion, there were civilians fleeing everywhere. Zabuza or no Zabuza, he was not going to let this continue. He was calling a retreat before something happened that brought humiliation to his village or worse, caused an international incident that sparked a war which Kiri most definitely didn't need at this time. As soon as his team extracted themselves from this debacle, they would regroup, head home, inform the captain that Konoha had captured their quarry, and let the diplomats deal with it after they got that whole Mizukage mess sorted out. Despite the fact that he was loath to leave a fight unfinished, he called a general retreat, and made for the sea with his remaining teammates, and one of the Konoha ninja following behind. That's it for part 4. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.